Move to the back now. I won't ask twice. The words landed in the cabin like a dropped glass. 12 other passengers heard them. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The woman in seat 1A did not even blink. To understand why those 7 words would end a man's career, you have to go back 3 hours. To a runway in Farmingdale, New York, where a Gulfstream G650 sat gleaming under a gray October sky, engines idling, waiting for a woman who had built an empire and was about to fly through it, disguised as a stranger. Her name was Solange Whitfield. On the manifest, she was listed as Sasha Whitfield, a small, deliberate distortion of her own name, the kind only she would ever notice. She was 41 years old. She owned Halcyon Air Charter. Outright. All of it. 41 aircraft, 612 employees, a hangar in 4 states, and a reputation in private aviation for a standard of service competitors had spent a decade trying and failing to copy. None of the 7 other passengers boarding flight HA-12 to Aspen that morning knew her name. That was exactly how she wanted it. She wore a charcoal wool coat that cost more than most people's rent and looked, to anyone not paying close attention, like nothing at all. No logo, no jewelry beyond a pair of small gold studs and a man's vintage watch with a cracked leather band she refused to replace. In her lap sat a journal, its cover scuffed brown leather, its spine held together with a strip of yellowed packing tape. She had carried it onto 41 different aircraft over 11 years. She had never once let anyone see what was written inside. The cabin itself was her own design philosophy made physical. 8 seats, cream leather, brushed platinum fixtures, dark walnut trim she had personally chosen, after rejecting 3 other samples. The design team had sworn were identical. They weren't identical. She could tell the difference under low cabin lighting, and if she could tell, a client eventually would too. That obsession with the difference nobody else noticed was, in a way, the entire company. It was also, she understood, the reason she was sitting here now, dressed like nobody, about to find out whether the thing she'd built was still the thing she'd meant to build. 3 feet away, in seat 2B, a man named Bradford Ellis was already on his 2nd phone call of the boarding process, narrating the details of a $110 million acquisition to someone who was very obviously not listening as closely as he wanted them to. Solange opened her journal, uncapped a pen, and wrote 1 line in small, precise handwriting. Review policy. Cabin phone etiquette during boarding. Disruptive. She had written 412 notes like it since she started flying her own routes anonymously. 390 of them had already become policy. This is the part of the story you need to hold on to, because it comes back later, twice. That journal did not belong to Solange first. It belonged to her grandmother, Odessa Whitfield, who cleaned 4 houses a week in Newark for 31 years and never once, in all that time, learned to read past a 4th grade level, but who filled the back pages of that same journal with the only thing she was ever taught to write well, her own name, over and over, in a hand she'd practiced until it was beautiful. Solange found the journal in a shoebox after the funeral. She was 23. She has carried it every single day since. Keep that in mind. It matters more than you think it does right now. Building Halcyon had not been a straight line. Solange spent her 20s working the ramp at a regional charter company in New Jersey, loading luggage in freezing rain, memorizing everything about how the business actually worked from the ground up. Because nobody was going to hand a 24-year-old black woman with no family money a seat in the boardroom without her first proving she understood every single job beneath it. She financed her first aircraft, a used Citation with 200,000 miles on the airframe, with a loan her own bank nearly refused her twice. She remembered sitting in that loan officer's beige office, watching him glance at her credit history, and then at her doing the silent arithmetic men like that always seemed to be doing, before he finally, reluctantly, signed. She never forgot his name either. It went in the journal too, on a page she never showed anyone, next to a note that read simply, "Remember what this felt like." By the time she was 35, Halcyon operated 9 aircraft. By 41. She had never once given a press interview about what it took to get there, because the story she wanted people to know wasn't hers. It was the one written into every training manual, every seating chart, every quiet review she conducted from a seat. Nobody suspected belonged to the owner. She had built, brick by brick, the exact kind of company that would have treated her grandmother like she belonged the moment she walked through the door. Whether it actually did that, consistently, when nobody was watching, was the only question that had ever really mattered to her. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with the choreography of people who had done this 1,000 times. The senior one, a sharp-featured woman named Denise Falk, laughed a half-second too loud at Bradford Ellis's jokes and refilled his water before he'd finished the first glass. The junior one, 26 years old, new to the crew, was a young woman named Grace Calloway, and she was the only person on that aircraft who looked directly at Solange and said good morning like she meant it. Solange noted her name in the journal too, with a small star beside it. She had learned, over 11 years of flying incognito, that the people worth watching were rarely the ones doing the performing. They were the ones doing the noticing. At 8:47 that morning, the cockpit door opened, and Captain Derek Holloway stepped into the cabin like a man walking onto a stage he believed belonged to him alone. He was 53, silver at the temples, 26 years of flight time behind him, and a personnel file back at Halcyon headquarters that Solange had reviewed herself 8 months earlier during a routine audit. 3. Formal complaints from junior staff about his temper, 1 HR note about dismissiveness toward female crew members, all of it buried under a flawless safety record, and 30 years of institutional memory that made him feel, to himself, untouchable. He had been kept on. Solange was beginning to understand that had been a mistake. Holloway's eyes swept the cabin and landed on Bradford Ellis first. "George, good to see you flying with us again." His voice filled the small space entirely, the way some men's voices do when they've never once had to compete for airtime. Ellis puffed up in his seat. "Good. I like having a pro at the stick," he said, and the two men shared the particular laugh of people who have never had to prove they belong anywhere. People who had worked under Captain Holloway for years could have told you, if anyone had ever bothered to ask, exactly who he was. He remembered the birthdays of first officers who reminded him of himself at 30. He wrote glowing recommendation letters for cadets whose fathers he'd flown with decades earlier, and he had, over 6 years, generated 3 separate complaints from junior female crew members, each one quietly closed, each one filed under language, soft enough to protect a flawless safety record that made him, in the eyes of the people above him, worth the trouble. He was not a cartoon. He believed, completely and sincerely, that he was a fair man, a standard bearer, someone protecting something worth protecting. That belief was exactly what made him dangerous. Men who know they're cruel can sometimes be reasoned with. Men who are certain they're righteous almost never can. Then Holloway's eyes moved to Solange, and something in his face closed like a door. He saw a black woman in a plain wool coat, with a battered journal in her lap, sitting in seat 1A, the best seat on the aircraft, and something ugly and automatic clicked into place behind his eyes. Not thought exactly, more like reflex, the kind that had never once in 53 years been challenged hard enough to break. He leaned toward Denise Falk and murmured something. Denise's professional smile flickered, just for a second, before she nodded. Solange felt the temperature of the cabin change before a single word was spoken. She had felt it before, in boardrooms, in bank lobbies, at the doors of restaurants that suddenly had no tables available. It was a particular kind of cold, She closed her journal and set it face down on the pull-out table in front of her, and waited. You'll want to remember that gesture, too. Closing the journal was never passive with Solange Whitfield. It was the sound of a decision being made. Act 2. Grace Calloway had been flying for Halcyon for 11 months, and in that time she had learned exactly one hard rule of the job. Never contradict the captain in front of a passenger, no matter what. Her training told her something different was about to happen in the next 90 seconds, and every part of her wanted to step forward and stop it. She did not move. She would carry that stillness for a long time afterward, and it would change what kind of person she decided to become. Captain Holloway crossed the cabin with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who wanted every passenger watching to understand this was going to be a performance. He stopped in front of seat 1A and addressed a point on the wall just above Solange's head, never quite meeting her eyes. "Ma'am," he said, in a tone that managed to be oily and cold at once, "we've got a bit of a seating situation. Mr. Ellis here is one of our most frequent flyers. He prefers this seat. We'd like to offer you something equally comfortable in row 4. Solange lifted her gaze slowly from where the journal had been. Her face was completely still.
"Is there a problem with my seat, Captain?"
"No problem with the seat," Holloway said, and something flickered behind his eyes. Irritation at being questioned by someone he'd already decided didn't have the standing to question him. "It's a courtesy we extend to our elite clients. Denise will help you with your things." He said your things the way a man says something he expects to be moved along quickly, and he had not once, in the entire exchange, used the word please. "I booked this seat 3 weeks ago," Solange said. Her voice did not rise. "It did not need to. I'd like to keep it." Something shifted in Holloway's jaw. 26 years of captaining aircraft had trained him to expect instant compliance to anything he said in that uniform. And here was a woman in a plain coat, sitting perfectly still, declining to move. Bradford Ellis watched from across the aisle with the small, satisfied smile of a man enjoying free theater. Grace Calloway, collecting glasses near the galley, froze completely, her eyes wide, a knot tightening low in her stomach. "Ma'am," Holloway said, his voice dropping an octave into something closer to a threat, "let's not make this difficult. I'm the captain of this aircraft. My instructions are not suggestions." "And I'm a paying passenger in the seat I reserved," Solange answered. "Who decides which passenger is more valued than another, Captain Holloway?" She used his name deliberately. It rattled him for exactly 1 second before his pride reasserted itself. "I do," he snapped. "On this aircraft, my word is final. Are you going to move, or do I need to have you removed for non-compliance?" The cabin had gone completely silent. Every other passenger who had been pretending not to watch was now watching openly. Denise Falk hovered nearby, her professional smile pulled tight over something closer to panic. This was the first tier. It would not be the last. Act 3. Here is what almost nobody in that cabin understood about the woman in seat 1A. Solange Whitfield had grown up 11 miles from that runway, in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Newark. Raised by a grandmother who worked with her hands until they cracked and bled in winter because she refused to buy gloves that would have cost her a week's grocery money, Solange remembered exactly one piece of advice Odessa Whitfield gave her, delivered from a hospital bed 3 weeks before she died of pancreatic cancer, machines beeping steadily in the background. "Baby," Odessa had said, her grip on Solange's hand still fierce, even as the rest of her was failing. "You let people show you exactly who they are. Don't argue them out of it. Just remember it, and never ever let anybody make you feel small. You were not built small." Solange was 23 when she buried her grandmother with $40 in her checking account and a business degree she'd financed almost entirely on loans. 18 years later, she owned an airline. She had never once forgotten the sentence. There was a specific memory she came back to more than any other. She was 9 years old, standing beside Odessa in the marble lobby of a downtown office building, where her grandmother cleaned 3 nights a week after the laundromat closed. A security guard had stopped them at the elevator bank and asked, not unkindly but not kindly either, whether they were lost. Odessa had answered in the same calm, even voice Solange would later recognize as her own on an aircraft 18 years afterward. "No, sir. I work on the 9th floor. Every night. 6 years now." The guard had let them through without an apology. Odessa never mentioned it again. But Solange watched her grandmother's shoulders that night, riding up in that elevator, and she understood something about the particular kind of tired that has nothing to do with hours worked. She had built her entire company around that elevator ride, quietly, in the language of hiring policy and training manuals, and a program she called the Halcyon Promise, which existed for exactly one reason: so that nobody who flew on one of her aircraft would ever be made to feel the way strangers had made her grandmother feel, standing at the edge of rooms she had every right to enter. She never told this story publicly. She flew undercover on her own routes 4 times a year, always under a slightly altered name, specifically to find out whether the promise she'd built her company on was actually real, or whether it was just words on a laminated card in a break room somewhere. Today, she was finding out. And what she was finding out was making her grandmother's voice louder in her head with every second that passed. Captain Holloway's hand moved her toward the intercom panel beside the galley, close enough that everyone in the cabin understood what he was reaching for. "That's it," he said. "I'm calling this in, unruly passenger. You've made a very big mistake." "No, Captain," Solange said, and something in her voice changed completely. Not louder, but colder, the kind of cold that makes a room go quiet in a way volume never could. "You have." Act 4. This is where it stopped being a misunderstanding and became something else entirely. Holloway's finger hovered over the intercom button. His face had gone a deep, mottled red, the color of a man who had never once in his career been told no. By someone he'd already decided didn't outrank him. "You're about to be charged with interfering with a flight crew," he said. "Do you understand what that means?" "Interference," Solange said, leaning forward slightly, "is when a passenger disrupts the safe operation of an aircraft. What you are doing right now, Captain, is abusing your authority to discriminate against a passenger. I take both of those things extremely seriously." Something about the phrasing snagged in Holloway's mind, but his pride was moving faster than his reason. "Discriminate," he repeated, and laughed, a short, ugly sound, a sound with no humor left in it at all. "Lady, I don't know what you think this is, but I've been flying for 26 years. I don't answer to passengers. Denise. Get security on standby at the gate." Here is what almost never gets said out loud in moments like this one, but needs to be said now. Everyone in that cabin had a choice in the next 90 seconds, and almost every one of them was about to choose comfort over courage. Bradford Ellis could have told his old flying buddy to stand down. He didn't. Denise Falk could have refused to make the call. She reached for the handset instead. 6 other passengers, seasoned enough to know exactly what they were watching, found sudden and urgent interest in their phones. This is the part of the story that should make you uncomfortable, because it is the most honest part. Most people, given the choice between doing the right thing and keeping their seat at the table, keep the seat. This was the second tier, the one meant to be witnessed, the one meant to humiliate completely. Denise Falk actually reached for the satellite handset, and it was in that exact moment that Grace Calloway did the only thing within her power. She did not speak. She did not have the standing to speak. Not yet, not with her job on the line and 11 months of seniority behind her. Instead, she quietly picked up the fallen journal that had slid half off the table in the commotion and set it gently back in front of Solange, spine facing up, cover intact. the way you'd hand someone back a piece of themselves. It was a small thing. It cost Grace nothing to do, and it would have cost her everything if Holloway had noticed and decided it counted as taking sides. He didn't notice. He was too busy watching Solange, waiting for her to break. She did not break. She opened the journal calmly, uncapped her pen, and wrote a single line while he watched, which unsettled him more than any argument could have. Then she looked back up. "Captain Holloway," she said, "I want you to think very carefully about what you do in the next 30 seconds, because I promise you, it is the only decision in this entire conversation that will actually matter." "Is that a threat?" His voice had climbed. Passengers were openly staring now. Bradford Ellis's smug grin had started, almost imperceptibly, to falter. "It's a courtesy," Solange said. "One you haven't extended to me a single time this morning." Holloway's hand came down on the intercom button. "Hard. Final. Tier 3. Ground control. This is Captain Holloway, requesting law enforcement's assistance at Gate 14 for an unruly passenger." The cabin went completely, absolutely silent. This was the frozen moment. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The hum of the auxiliary power unit, suddenly the loudest sound in the world. Grace Calloway's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. Denise Falk had gone pale, the color draining out of her face, in a way that looked almost medical. Bradford Ellis had stopped smiling entirely, his phone forgotten in his hand, the acquisition call disconnected and unmourned, and Solange Whitfield sat perfectly still in seat 1A, watching a man dismantle his own career in real time, and did not say a single word until he had finished. Somewhere behind the cockpit door, unnoticed by everyone in that moment, the aircraft's cockpit voice recorder continued doing exactly what federal regulation required it to do. It was capturing every syllable. Hold on to that fact. It will matter enormously. Later, in a room none of these passengers will ever see. Act 5.
Are you finished, Captain?
Holloway's chest was heaving slightly. "You'll be escorted off this aircraft the moment ground crew arrives." "I'd like you to look at something first," Solange said, and reached into the inner pocket of her coat. She did not pull out a phone. She pulled out a slim black wallet, opened it, and set a single card on the pull-out table between them. Heavy black cardstock, platinum lettering engraved, not printed. Solange Whitfield, founder and chief executive officer, Halcyon Air Charter. Holloway stared at it the way a man stares at a snake he's already been bitten by. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked at the card, then at her, then back at the card, his mind visibly failing to connect the plain wool coat and the cracked leather journal to the name on the tail fin of the very aircraft he was standing in. He started. "That's not possible. The owner is. Everyone knows the owner is." "Everyone assumes a great many things," Solange said. "That's rather the point of today." This was layer A of the reveal. The card, the object, the undeniable physical proof. It was not enough on its own, not for a man like Holloway, whose pride was already constructing an escape route. "Cards can be printed," he said, though his voice had lost most of its certainty. "Anyone can print a card." Solange picked up the sat phone from its cradle without breaking eye contact with him and dialed a number from memory. It rang twice. "Elliot," she said, when the line connected, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "It's Solange. I need you to confirm something for the captain of Flight HA-12. Please. He doesn't believe I own the company he works for." The voice that came through the speaker belonged to Elliot Reyes, Halcyon's chief operating officer for 11 years. A man whose voice half the senior staff in the company would have recognized instantly. "Captain Holloway," Elliot said, crisp and entirely, without warmth. "You are speaking with Solange Whitfield, founder and sole owner of Halcyon Air Charter. I'd strongly advise you stop talking until ground crew arrives. And Captain, turn that intercom request around. Nobody is being removed from that aircraft except possibly you." This was layer B, the confirmation from a third party with real authority, and it landed on Holloway like a physical blow. The color drained entirely from his face. His hand, still resting near the intercom, began to shake. Bradford Ellis, who had spent the last 20 minutes smirking his way through another man's humiliation, suddenly looked as though he might be sick. He had been cheering quietly for the man currently insulting the owner of the airline he flew 4 times a month. He sank lower into seat 2B, trying uselessly to disappear. I didn't know, Holloway stammered, and there it was, the first crack, though not the apology. Never the apology. Not yet. Not from a man like this. You didn't ask, Solange said quietly. You looked at me and decided you already knew everything you needed to know. That was your mistake, Captain. Not this conversation. This conversation is just where it caught up with you. Act 6. Ground crew met the aircraft at the gate 14 minutes later. Captain Derek Holloway was escorted off Halcyon Air charter property. That same afternoon, his credentials suspended pending review, 26 years of seniority, evaporating in the space of a single flight he had chosen, entirely on his own, to make a battleground. You would think that was the end of it. It wasn't. It was only the end of the part that happened in public. Solange did not fire him from a distance. She insisted on the exit conversation happening face-to-face, in Halcyon's executive lounge at headquarters, 3 days later, with Elliot Reyes standing silent by the window. Holloway walked in, still defiant, still certain, somewhere underneath the fear, that this was all some kind of misunderstanding that would resolve in his favor if he just held his ground long enough. It was the same instinct that had cost him everything on the aircraft. He hadn't learned a thing. You have a right to know why, Solange told him, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were 3 prior complaints from junior staff going back 6 years. Complaints that had been minimized, filed, and forgotten by people who valued his seniority over the discomfort of the people beneath him. This was never about one bad flight, Captain. This was a pattern the company let you get away with for 6 years. Today is simply the day it stopped being invisible. Holloway looked at the folder for a long time. When he finally spoke, it wasn't an apology. It was a justification. Protocol, standards, the value of an elite client, the same language he'd used on the aircraft, dressed up now as reasoned defense instead of naked authority. He did not say sorry. Not once. Solange watched him talk himself into believing his own excuse, and understood with total clarity that some people cannot be reasoned out of a position they never reasoned themselves into. Thank you for your honesty, she said, finally standing. You've made this very easy. His termination was final, immediate, and permanently on his Federal Aviation record. That should have been the end of it. It was not. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, Elliot Reyes walked into Solange's office without knocking, his phone already turned toward her, before he'd finished crossing the room. The headline filled the screen like a slap. Disgraced pilote sues Halcyon Aviation, claims reverse, discrimination and wrongful termination. Beneath it, a professionally shot photograph of Derek Holloway, no longer in uniform, dressed instead in a tailored Navy suit. His expression arranged into something that resembled wounded dignity, but had clearly been coached into place by someone who understood cameras better than he ever had. The lawsuit demanded $50 million. Holloway, represented now by an aggressive media-savvy law firm with a track record of turning corporate disputes into culture war spectacles, claimed he'd been sacrificed to protect a CEO's public image. A veteran pilot, with an unblemished safety record cast aside without due process by an oversensitive executive on a power trip. The filing painted him as the true victim in the story. An experienced professional destroyed for the crime of enforcing standard protocol. He gave interviews. Within a week, he'd become a recurring guest on a cable news program, with a loyal, furious audience, appearing under chyrons that read pilot or scapegoat, and framing himself as a martyr for a bygone era of common sense. A good man crushed by a corporation more interested in optics than fairness. He was calm on camera, reasonable sounding, likable in the specific way people are likable when they've rehearsed their own victimhood, until it feels like truth. A hashtag started small and grew fast. A handful of long-time Halcyon clients, quietly sympathetic to Holloway's version of events, sent letters announcing they were canceling their memberships. Several of them echoing his language about political correctness in the cockpit, almost word for word. "He's not just suing us," Solange said one evening, scrolling through the coverage with her jaw set tight. "He's putting the entire culture of this company on trial in front of an audience that's already decided how the story ends." "It's worse than that," Elliot said. "Legally, his case is flimsy. We have the documented complaints, the cockpit recording, his own words. But this was never going to be won in a courtroom first. It's a war for public opinion, and he's already 3 weeks ahead of us." Solange refused every suggestion from her PR team to fight fire with fire, to book competing interviews, to trade insults in the press. "We will not be dragged into the mud with him," she told them, in a strategy meeting that ran 2 hours past its scheduled end. "Our response happens in a court of law, built on facts, not on cable news soundbites. Let the evidence speak. It always does, eventually, if you're patient enough to let it." Patience, in that particular season, cost her more than she let anyone see. The stock dipped. Reporters called the front desk, asking for comment on questions designed to make any answer sound like an admission. And then came the detail that turned an already difficult month into something far more dangerous. Holloway's legal filings contained details he should never have had access to after his termination. Internal training documents, confidential financial figures tied to a bonus structure for the Halcyon Promise program, language lifted almost verbatim from a presentation given to senior staff only. Someone inside the company was still feeding him information.
We have a leak,
Elliot Reyes said grimly. One night in Solange's office, the city lights spread out below the window. Someone loyal to Holloway is still inside the building. The internal investigation that followed was quiet, careful, and consumed 6 exhausting weeks. Elliot Reyes and Halcyon's head of cybersecurity worked through server logs late into the night, tracing patterns of file access that shouldn't have existed after a termination. They focused on senior staff, the ones who'd flown alongside Holloway for decades, the ones who might resent a company reshaping itself around a younger, more diverse generation of leadership. The trail was faint, buried under layers of deliberate misdirection, but it was there. And it led straight to a 30-year veteran pilot named Craig Dunmore, passed over 3 months earlier for a chief pilot position that went instead to a woman named Priya Anand, a decision Dunmore had never forgiven, not for a single day. Encrypted messages traced back to Holloway's legal team confirmed it beyond doubt. Solange confronted him herself in the same lounge where Holloway's career had ended, the symbolism entirely intentional. Dunmore walked into that lounge with the confident, almost defiant swagger of a man who believed 30 years of seniority made him untouchable. He did not deny it. He didn't even try.
You ruined this company,
he spat, all pretense gone, his voice climbing with every sentence, like something long dammed up had finally broken loose. Your diversity policies, your training modules. This used to be a place for the best pilots in the country, and now it's a social experiment. You destroyed a good man's career over a seating arrangement. You promoted Anand over me because she checks a box, not because she's better. Holloway was right. Somebody needed to stand up to you. His voice cracked on the last word, not from grief, but from the particular rage of a man watching a version of the world he'd counted on collapse in real time. You think you're building something. You're not. You're just tearing down everything that used to work. Solange let him finish every word without flinching. When he was done, the room was silent, except for a jet engine whining somewhere far off on the tarmac. "Thank you for your honesty," she said again. The second time she'd said that exact sentence to a man who had just destroyed himself in front of her. "You believe this company is defined by who it excludes. I believe it's defined by who it includes. Your friendship with Derek Holloway didn't give you the right to conspire against the company that employed you for 30 years. You're terminated, effective now, and unlike Captain Holloway, you won't be waiting on a lawsuit to find out the consequences. You'll be named as a co-conspirator in his. You didn't just lose your job, Captain Dunmore. You just became the star witness against your friend." Craig Dunmore's face went from defiant to hollow in the space of 4 seconds. He had walked in believing he was a whistleblower. He walked out having made himself evidence. Act 7. Halcyon's legal team filed a countersuit within the month: defamation, tortious interference, naming the cable network that had platformed Holloway's version of events as a co-defendant. The evidence was overwhelming: documented complaints, a confessed informant, Holloway's own recorded words on the aircraft's cockpit voice log, preserved automatically, exactly as federal aviation regulations require. His $50 million lawsuit collapsed within 8 weeks. His pilot's license, already suspended, was permanently revoked by federal aviation regulators for conduct violations. The kind of ending that doesn't make headlines the way the accusation did, but ends a career completely. And finally, all the same. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a storm like that one. Once the lawsuits are settled and the cameras move on to the next outrage, it isn't peace, not exactly. It's closer to the quiet after surgery, the body still healing beneath a wound that's finally been allowed to close. Halcyon spent that quiet season rebuilding something more durable than its reputation. Promotions and bonuses were tied, from that point forward, not only to performance metrics, but to peer-reviewed assessments of character, of how people treated the ones with less power than themselves when nobody senior was watching. It was slower than a press release. It was also the only kind of change that actually holds. 8 months after Flight HA-12, Solange stood in the same terminal in Farmingdale, boarding another Halcyon aircraft, this time to a technology conference in Denver. The morning air had the same October bite to it, the same gray light over the tarmac. Close enough to the original flight that for one strange moment she felt as though she might be about to relive it. She wasn't. That was the entire point of standing there again. The crew that greeted her at the gate included a new captain, Priya Anand, 39 years old, sharp-eyed, entirely without the practiced fawning Holloway had once perfected. "Ms. Whitfield," Anand said, meeting her eyes directly, "welcome aboard. Seat 1A is ready for you. It's an honor to fly you today." There was no performance in it, just respect, plain and unadorned, the way it should have been from the very beginning. Grace Calloway, the young flight attendant who had quietly set a fallen journal back in front of a stranger 8 months earlier, was no longer junior crew. She now led the very training module built out of that flight, a program every employee at Halcyon, executives included, completed annually. It wasn't a dry compliance video. It was immersive, scenario-based, designed to put people inside the exact moment Grace herself had once frozen in, and teach them what to do differently before their hands started shaking. She still remembered vividly the particular kind of fear that had kept her rooted in place near that galley. The fear of a bad report ending a career that had barely started. She used that fear now, on purpose, in every session she taught, because she understood something most trainers never learn. You cannot teach courage by pretending fear isn't real. You teach it by naming the fear out loud and showing people what to do with it anyway. She had grown, in 8 months, into someone who no longer needed permission to speak. Customer satisfaction was at an all-time high. Corporate accounts were up 22%. Employee turnover had dropped to its lowest point in a decade. Halcyon's reputation, far from damaged, had grown, particularly among clients who had spent their whole lives being made to feel they didn't belong in rooms they'd every right to be in. The $40,000 in canceled memberships from Holloway's brief media moment had been replaced tenfold by people who finally trusted where they were flying. As the aircraft leveled off over Pennsylvania, Solange opened the journal in her lap. The same one, spine still held together with a strip of tape she'd never bothered to replace, because some things are worth keeping exactly as broken and mended as they actually are. She uncapped her pen and wrote a single new line on a fresh page. The standard isn't what you expect from people, it's what you inspect and what you protect. Below it, smaller, she added 3 more words, the ones she wrote at the start of every flight, the ones nobody but her had ever read. For you, Grandma. Somewhere in a small apartment outside Hartford, months later, an envelope arrived at Grace Calloway's door. Inside was a short, handwritten letter. It wasn't from Solange. It was from Derek Holloway, working now as a driving instructor, his aviation career permanently closed to him. He didn't ask for his job back. He didn't defend himself. He wrote 4 sentences, the first honest ones he'd spoken since the day his voice filled that cabin like it owned it. He said he'd spent 30 years mistaking a uniform for character. He said he was sorry, finally, actually sorry, not for getting caught, but for the woman in seat 1A, and for every person before her he'd never bothered to really see. He didn't expect forgiveness. He said he just needed once to say it out loud to someone who'd actually witnessed the truth. Grace read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. She never showed it to anyone. Some things, she was learning, you just carry. If this story stayed with you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognize someone in it, maybe even yourself, in a room where you stayed quiet when it mattered, that's worth sitting with for a moment before you go. Think about the version of you that was in that cabin. Were you the one who stayed silent, or the one who quietly picked the journal back up? Either way, you already know which one you want to be next time.